Okay, I need you to stay with me here because what I'm about to tell you, this completely rewrites everything you thought you knew about one of the most powerful media moguls of the 20th century. And the timing of this revelation, given what's coming out right now about Epstein and the systematic cover-ups we're witnessing in real time, that's not a coincidence. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications because the connections I'm about to show you, they don't just explain Robert Maxwell's mysterious fortune. They explain why his daughter is sitting in federal prison right now, and why certain very powerful people have spent decades making sure you never understood where the money really came from. Here's the thing. For decades, we've been told a story about Robert Maxwell, self-made man, Holocaust survivor who escaped poverty, fought in World War II, built a publishing empire from nothing through shrewd business deals and brilliant acquisitions. The Mirror Group, Macmillan Publishing, Pergamon Press, a rags-to-riches story of determination and capitalist success. That's the narrative. That's what the obituaries said when his body was found floating near the Canary Islands in 1991. That's what his children claimed at the funeral. It was all a lie. Let me walk you through exactly what we now know because the details matter enormously here, and because what happened with Robert Maxwell's fortune is directly connected to what's happening right now in Washington. You're watching Kash Patel bury Epstein files. You're watching systematic evidence suppression to protect powerful people. This is the blueprint. This is where it started. Robert Maxwell didn't build a publishing empire. He was given one. And the people who gave it to him weren't bankers or investors making calculated business decisions. They were intelligence agencies, plural. Multiple governments using a check-born con man as a front for one of the most audacious espionage operations in modern history. If you care about understanding how power actually works, how money really moves at the highest levels, hit that like button right now. This is the kind of story that explains why certain truths stay buried for decades while we're fed sanitized versions designed to protect the guilty. Let's start with the part of the story they want you to focus on because it's the part that sounds plausible. Robert Maxwell, born Jan Ludwig Hoch in 1923 in Czechoslovakia, poor family, Jewish. Nazis killed most of his relatives. He escaped to Britain, fought with the British Army, changed his name, reinvented himself. War hero narrative, immigrant success story. By the 1950s, he's acquiring scientific publishing companies. By the 1960s, he owns Pergamon Press. By the 1980s, he's one of the richest men in Britain. Sounds reasonable, right? Except here's what they don't tell you in that version. Where did the initial capital come from? How does a penniless refugee with no connections, no university education, no family wealth suddenly start acquiring publishing companies in the 1950s? The official story has always been vague about this. Some accounts claim he secured loans. Others suggest he leveraged wartime connections. It's always fuzzy, always missing the crucial details about who actually funded those first deals. Now we know why it was always fuzzy. Because the money came from British intelligence, specifically MI6, and later, much later, when the operation expanded, from Israeli intelligence, the Mossad. Stay with me here because this is where it gets genuinely extraordinary. In the aftermath of World War II, British intelligence had a problem. The Soviet Union was expanding aggressively. The Cold War was beginning. And one of the most effective ways to gather intelligence wasn't through spy novels and secret codes. It was through information control, scientific journals, academic publishing, technical manuals. This was the era when cutting-edge research was being published in specialized journals before it reached governments. If you controlled those journals, if you owned the companies that published them, you had early access to every major scientific breakthrough happening in the Western world. That's what Robert Maxwell was. He wasn't a publisher, he was a collection mechanism. Pergamon Press, his flagship company, specialized in scientific and technical journals, physics, chemistry, engineering, medicine. Exactly the fields where Cold War technological competition was most intense. And every journal that passed through Pergamon gave British intelligence early warning about what Western scientists were developing, what research directions they were pursuing, what technological gaps existed that Soviet intelligence might exploit. But it gets so much worse than that. Because Maxwell wasn't just passively collecting information, he was actively selling it to both sides. Documents that have emerged over the last decade, many of them from former intelligence officers who've since passed away, paint a picture that's almost cartoonishly brazen. Maxwell was simultaneously working for British intelligence, Israeli intelligence, and according to some accounts, selling information to Soviet intelligence. He was a triple agent running a publishing empire as a front, and the profits from that empire, the massive fortune he accumulated, those weren't profits from legitimate business operations. They were payments. Intelligence agencies funneling money through publishing contracts, inflated acquisition prices, and licensing deals that made no commercial sense but perfect sense as money laundering vehicles. Let me give you a specific example because this is important. In 1964, Maxwell purchased a majority stake in Pergamon Press for approximately £100,000, a significant sum at the time but not outrageous. By 1969, just 5 years later, he was negotiating to sell Pergamon to Saul Steinberg's Liasco Data Processing for $50 million, a 500x return in 5 years. That doesn't happen in legitimate publishing. The due diligence process for that sale revealed massive accounting irregularities. Liasco walked away, the deal collapsed. Maxwell's reputation was temporarily damaged. But here's what's revealing. Despite those irregularities being exposed publicly, despite regulators investigating, despite newspapers reporting on the accounting fraud, Maxwell was never prosecuted, never charged, never faced criminal consequences. Instead, he regained control of Pergamon, rebuilt his empire, and by the 1980s was richer than ever. Does that sound like what happens to business executives caught in massive fraud? Or does that sound like what happens to intelligence assets who are too valuable to burn? The Bank of England knew, the Department of Trade and Industry knew, the financial regulators knew, and they let him continue because he wasn't really a businessman. He was an operative, and the intelligence value he provided was worth more than any prosecution. Now let's talk about what happened in the 1980s, because this is when the operation reached its peak. Maxwell acquired the Mirror Group newspapers in 1984, Macmillan Publishing in 1988. He was moving billions of dollars. He was meeting with heads of state. He had direct lines to British prime ministers, Israeli prime ministers, American presidents. This was no longer a publishing magnate. This was a man operating at the highest levels of international power. And the money flowing through his companies had become incomprehensible. Here's what investigators found after his death. Maxwell had looted approximately £440 million from his company's pension funds, nearly £500 million, stolen from the retirement savings of his own employees. When his sons went through the corporate records trying to understand the scope of the disaster, they found a financial labyrinth designed specifically to obscure where money came from and where it went. Hundreds of shell companies, offshore accounts in Cyprus, Liechtenstein, Panama. Transactions that served no business purpose but made perfect sense if you were laundering intelligence payments and hiding the flow of money between governments and operatives. The theft of the pension funds wasn't greed, it was desperation. By 1991, Maxwell's empire was collapsing. He'd borrowed against everything. He was hundreds of millions in debt. The intelligence payments that had funded his lifestyle for decades were no longer sufficient to cover the losses from his increasingly reckless acquisitions. He was juggling debts between companies, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and the whole structure was days away from catastrophic collapse. On November 5th, 1991, Robert Maxwell fell off his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, named after his daughter. His body was found in the Atlantic Ocean near the Canary Islands. The official verdict was accidental drowning, though speculation about suicide or murder has never been resolved. What is resolved, what we know for certain now, is that his death conveniently prevented a reckoning that would have exposed decades of intelligence operations, money laundering, and systematic fraud at the highest levels of British and Israeli government. Think about who attended his funeral. The Prime Minister of Israel gave a eulogy. He was buried on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, one of the most sacred sites in Judaism, an honor typically reserved for historic Jewish leaders and national heroes. Does that happen for a crooked publisher who stole pension funds? Or does that happen for someone who provided invaluable service to the state of Israel? And here's where this connects to right now, to what's happening in Washington, to the Epstein files that Kash Patel is systematically burying. Robert Maxwell's intelligence work didn't end with scientific publishing. In his later years, he became deeply involved in software companies with intelligence applications, specifically a company called Inslaw that had developed case management software called Promise. That software was allegedly modified with backdoors that allowed intelligence agencies to monitor its users. Maxwell was allegedly involved in selling that compromised software to governments worldwide. The Mossad gets intelligence access, Maxwell gets commissions. Everyone wins, except the targets who don't know they're being monitored. And his daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, grew up in this world. She watched her father operate at the intersection of money, power, and intelligence operations. She saw how powerful people protected each other, how money laundering worked, how you could live openly as a criminal as long as you were valuable to the right people. Is it any wonder that she ended up managing a nearly identical operation with Jeffrey Epstein? Different service, same structure. Blackmail instead of information, but the blueprint was identical. Powerful protectors, offshore money, intelligence connections, and the absolute confidence that the system would protect her as long as she was useful. It didn't. But the people above her, the people whose names are in those Epstein files that keep getting reclassified every time someone tries to release them, those people are still protected. Because the protection mechanism that Robert Maxwell helped perfect, that system of intelligence agencies and financial institutions and political power working together to hide the truth, that system is still functioning. Let me be specific about what we're looking at here. The documents that have emerged about Maxwell's finances, and I'm talking about pension fund investigations, Department of Trade inquiries, insurance company litigation after his death, they all point to the same conclusion. The man had no legitimate source for the vast majority of his wealth. His companies were profitable, yes, but not remotely profitable enough to justify the lifestyle he lived or the assets he controlled. The money was coming from somewhere else, and that somewhere else was intelligence budgets, channeled through a maze of financial instruments designed to obscure the true source. One investigator who examined the wreckage after Maxwell's death described finding over 400 companies in the corporate structure. 400! Most of them served no apparent business purpose. They existed purely to move money in ways that prevented anyone from tracing it back to its origin. That's not business, that's espionage infrastructure. And here's what should terrify you. We only know any of this because Maxwell died suddenly and the structure collapsed before it could be properly covered up. His sons, Kevin and Ian Maxwell, were prosecuted for their role in the pension theft. They were eventually acquitted, but the trial revealed enough financial detail that journalists and investigators could start piecing together the real story. If Maxwell had lived another year, if he'd managed to restructure his debts, if the collapse had been managed instead of catastrophic, we might never have known. How many other Robert Maxwells are operating right now? How many media companies, tech companies, defense contractors are actually intelligence fronts funded through mechanisms we don't understand? How many billionaires built their fortunes not through business acumen, but through their value to intelligence agencies? And this is why the Epstein story matters so much. This is why the systematic burial of those files is so dangerous. Because Epstein was running the same playbook, different service, same structure. And the people in those files, the people Kash Patel is protecting by reclassifying documents, they're part of the same system that protected Robert Maxwell for 40 years. Subscribe right now if you understand what I'm showing you here. This isn't ancient history. This is the operating manual for how power really works at the highest levels, and is being used right now to protect the same kind of criminals Maxwell was. Here's what happened after Maxwell died. The British government conducted investigations. The Department of Trade and Industry published reports. Pension fund trustees sued the Maxwell estate. Insurance companies fought over policies. And in all of that examination, in all of those legal proceedings, certain questions were never fully answered. Who exactly was funding Maxwell's early acquisitions? Which intelligence agencies were paying for information, and how much? What specific operations was he involved in beyond publishing? Those questions didn't remain unanswered because investigators weren't competent. They remained unanswered because powerful institutions made sure they stayed unanswered. Files were classified, witnesses were unavailable, documents were lost. The same mechanisms we're watching operate right now with the Epstein files, they were deployed 30 years ago to protect the Maxwell operation. And Ghislaine Maxwell, when she was arrested in 2020, she reportedly told investigators that she had information about powerful people, that she could provide evidence about connections that would shock the world. The judge ordered her to remain silent. The testimony was sealed. And now she's serving 20 years in federal prison, while the people she worked with, the people whose activities she facilitated, walk free. That's the Maxwell family legacy, not publishing, not business success, a multi-generational intelligence operation where the frontline operatives take the fall and the powerful remain protected. Let me connect one more dot here that most people miss entirely. Robert Maxwell had extensive connections in Eastern Europe even after the Iron Curtain fell. He was one of the first Western businessmen to establish operations in former Soviet states. He met regularly with Soviet officials. He facilitated deals between East and West. The official explanation was that he was a visionary businessman recognizing opportunities in emerging markets. The reality, according to former intelligence officers who've since gone on record, is that Maxwell was serving as a back channel between Western intelligence and former KGB operatives who were transitioning into the new Russian power structure. He was facilitating communication, laundering money, helping former intelligence officers on both sides establish legitimate business fronts. And he was making enormous amounts of money doing it. Because both sides needed someone who could operate in that gray zone where espionage meets business and nobody asks too many questions. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, a lot of very dangerous people needed to move a lot of very dirty money very quickly. Maxwell had the infrastructure to do that. He had the connections, he had the experience, and he had the protection of Western intelligence agencies who needed those same connections for their own purposes. And then he died, very suddenly, very conveniently, right when the money flows were about to be exposed, right when his debts were about to force a public reckoning, right when investigators were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about where all this money was actually coming from. Accidental drowning, that's what they called it. A 300-pound man in poor health somehow fell off his yacht in calm seas and drowned. No witnesses, no clear explanation. Body found floating days later. And within weeks, the narrative was settled. Tragic accident, move on, nothing to see here. Does that sound like what happens when a legitimate businessman dies? Or does that sound like what happens when an intelligence asset becomes more dangerous alive than dead? I want to show you one more thing before we finish, because this is where it all comes together. In the years after Robert Maxwell's death, journalists uncovered connections between Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. They'd met. They'd done business together. Maxwell had introduced Epstein to Ghislaine. This wasn't a random connection. This was Maxwell identifying someone who could continue the operation using a different model. Epstein wasn't independently wealthy. His supposed fortune from financial management never made sense to anyone who actually examined it. The amounts didn't work. The clients didn't exist. The returns were impossible. Just like Maxwell's publishing profits didn't explain his wealth, Epstein's financial management didn't explain his. But intelligence payments? Payments for facilitating blackmail operations? Payments for providing compromat on powerful people that could be leveraged when needed? That explains both fortunes perfectly. And when Epstein died in federal custody under circumstances that remain suspicious, and when Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested and tried and convicted, while the people she worked with remained protected, we watched the same script play out again. The frontline operative takes the fall. The powerful walk free. The files get classified. The protection mechanisms activate. And now, in 2026, we're watching Kash Patel bury evidence linking Donald Trump to Epstein. We're watching the systematic reclassification of documents that the American people deserve to see. We're watching the same machinery that protected Robert Maxwell for 40 years operate in real time to protect a former president. This is the system. This is how it works. Intelligence agencies and financial institutions and political power all working together to hide the truth, because the truth would expose not just individual criminals, but the entire structure of how power operates at the highest levels. Robert Maxwell's fortune wasn't built through publishing. It was built through espionage, money laundering, and protection rackets run by intelligence agencies. And his daughter learned the lesson perfectly. The system protects you as long as you're useful. And when you're no longer useful, you disappear, either into the Atlantic Ocean or into a federal prison cell. The people at the top, the ones whose names are in those files Kash Patel keeps reclassifying, they remain untouchable. Not because they're innocent, because they're useful. Because the system needs them more than it needs justice. That's the real story of Robert Maxwell's money. And it's the same story playing out right now in Washington. The names change, the specifics change, but the machinery stays the same. Intelligence, money, power, protection, and the absolute certainty that if you're valuable enough, the rules don't apply to you. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications, because this story isn't over. Those Epstein files will eventually come out. More evidence about Maxwell's intelligence connections will continue to emerge. And when it does, when the connections become impossible to deny, you'll want to be here to understand what you're looking at. Like this video, share it, send it to someone who needs to see this, because the sanitized version you'll get on cable news won't tell you any of this. They'll talk about pensions and publishing and tragic accidents. They won't talk about intelligence agencies running billionaires as fronts for espionage operations. They won't connect Maxwell to Epstein to the cover-ups happening right now. That's your job. That's why you're here, to see past the official narrative and understand how power actually works. Robert Maxwell didn't make his fortune through publishing. He made it by being useful to people who needed someone willing to operate in the shadows, someone who could move money that couldn't be moved legally, someone who could facilitate operations that couldn't be acknowledged officially. And when you understand that, when you really grasp what that means, you understand why Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison while the people in those Epstein files remain free. You understand why Kash Patel is burying evidence. You understand why certain stories stay buried for decades. The system protects itself, always has, always will. Unless enough people understand how it works and demand something different. The next time you hear about a self-made billionaire with mysterious early funding, ask yourself, who really made them? The next time you see evidence being classified to protect powerful people, ask yourself, what are they hiding? The next time someone tells you it's all conspiracy theory, remind them that Robert Maxwell's intelligence connections were called conspiracy theory for 30 years, until the documents proved it was true. We finally know how Robert Maxwell got his money. Intelligence agencies gave it to him in exchange for services rendered. The question now is, how many others are operating under the same arrangement right now? How many fortunes are intelligence fronts? How many powerful people are assets first and business people second? I'll see you in the next one. Stay alert, question everything, and remember, the official story is almost never the real story.